Well, hi, and welcome back to Everybody Loves Politics. I'm Tom Bullington, your host. And today I'm honored to have Michael Brodkorb is here, a Republican activist and now a columnist with MinnPost.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. We had you on about a year ago, and quite a few things have changed since then. I think at that time there were still 17 Republicans running for president. Of course, now we have one, Donald Trump is the nominee. Because the Minnesota State Republican Party does control ballot access,
Correct,
or the names that are going to be on the ballot for the upcoming national election. You were in the paper, you were on CNN, national coverage of this, that, oops, Donald Trump ended up not being on the ballot for the November election. What happened there, and maybe talk about that a little bit.
What happened was, in Minnesota we have basically two classifications of political parties. We have major political parties, those that where their candidates have run statewide and received a certain percentage of the vote, more than 5%. And then we have minor political parties. When it comes to ballot access, in terms of names that appear on a ballot, Republicans and Democrats in this state, because they're classified as major political parties, it's much more easy. It's easier for their candidates to appear on the ballot. What's required is that on a presidential race, the requirement to get Hillary Clinton, who is the Democratic nominee for president, along with Donald Trump, who's the Republican nominee for president, what it requires is a letter that the party chairman sends to the Secretary of State informing him of three groups of people. Number one, the name of the president and vice presidential pick, nominee for the respective party, the names of 10 presidential electors and 10 alternate electors. What happened in Minnesota was that the Republican Party in Minnesota forgot to elect alternate presidential electors. And what that means is, as you know, and I hope that we can educate a little bit on this show, we don't have the direct election of president in this country. What happens is voters will cast their ballots on election day, and then ultimately the Electoral College will meet, which is a group of people designated in each state.
These are actual people.
Actual people who
okay.
will, yes,
Yep.
And it's determined by your electoral vote count is determined by the number of members of Congress you have, which includes, in Minnesota, 8 members of the House of Representatives plus 2 United States senators, so we have 10 electoral votes. What will happen on sometime in December, after the election, is that members of the Electoral College will meet all across the country, but particularly in Minnesota they will meet, and those 10 individuals will cast their ballots in reflecting the vote of how Minnesotans voted. So, for example, if Donald Trump were to win the state of Minnesota, Republican electors would cast their ballots for Trump. The same would happen if Hillary won. The Democratic electors would elect for Hillary. Minnesota hasn't voted for a Republican president since before I was born, 1972, Richard Nixon. And so the likelihood that the Republican electors will be voting for Donald Trump is, I think, between slim and nay, in terms of happening. But Republicans missed a critical step in that process. And what happened is the Secretary of State's office does a fantastic job. Steve Simon's office does a fantastic job continuing the work of Mark Ritchie in terms of promoting and finding a nonpartisan way in which people can get information on the presidential candidates. Publishes, as the names were being certified and coming in, the names that would appear on the sample ballot, which would then be turned into the general election ballot.
Sure.
Donald Trump's name was missing from that. And the reason Donald Trump's name was missing from that is because the Republican Party forgot to elect presidential alternates, and they had to kind of come up with this Band-Aid fix in which to get the names listed on a form so they could submit it to the Secretary of State. They were late in doing so. Worth noting that a variety of minor party candidates, including the Legalized Marijuana Now Party, was able to get it done before the Republican Party did. Okay. Minor party candidates have to get thousands of signatures, over 2,000 signatures that they need to get. What ends up actually happening is usually they get a much larger number than 2,000 because they need to be eligible voters, and some names are removed from the list.
Sure.
Some people aren't eligible voters, or there's a deficiency in the standing of the person that's signed in some way, and so they're removed. So what that's been left with, what we're facing now in Minnesota, is the possibility that there could be a legal challenge based on the process by which the Republicans listed alternate electors,
Okay.
and whether it was done in compliance with the law.
And they missed the deadline.
They
correct?
made the
Okay.
deadline.
Made the deadline.
They made the deadline, but there's really no way in the statute and law for the Secretary of State to reject the names. It's one of the few aspects of partisan politics that's really codified in state law, and it says what the role of the party the respective chairs of the party need to do. And what it takes is the chairs to send a letter over certifying that these are the people that were elected. Well, the party did not, as according to state statute, nominate and elect people through conventions. And that wasn't done. And so the question remains as to whether there will be a legal challenge to Trump's name appearing on the ballot. There is a strong sense, we're weeks, if not months past the Republican and Democratic National Convention. But what is still burning inside the party is this type of never Trump movement. We've seen a variety of third-party candidates being able to tap into that and win over some support of some people that should be traditional Republican voters. The Democrats have done a much better job of uniting their party. And when the Republicans met in Cleveland, the city of rock and roll, and they weren't as united. But the Democrats met in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and they came together in a very unified way.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're seeing coming in, as we're coming into the general election now, we're past the primary, and you have two candidates, you're seeing a fractured Republican Party that's not very cohesive. And it lends itself to a situation where mistakes are made.
Sure, sure. Now, you mentioned third parties. So we're talking about Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, and then also an individual named Evan McMullen, who is an independent. He's on the ballot here in Minnesota as the Independence Party candidate for Minnesota, hoping that they can get to a 5% threshold to become major party status again. Any thoughts on their chances? I know Johnson is probably the closest as far as getting on the debate stage that's coming up. I know the threshold for that's 15%. Just your thoughts on these third-party candidates, and are they going to tip the balance one way or the other, or?
Well, let's talk about the election cycle.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very difficult for an independent to win the presidency. We are largely a two-party country, and as novel of the concept of a third party, we really haven't seen a strong third-party candidate really break through in any type of significant way since probably Ross Perot in terms of it. We haven't, there's been talk of other candidates. In fact, there was questions as to whether Trump would run as an independent party candidate.
Right.
And so what you're seeing with these minor party candidates that are coming forward, they don't have what I would say the kind of large personality, the kind of celebrity status, and it really shows how difficult it is in terms of a presidential race to wage a successful third-party candidacy. Where they'll have an impact are in some states if the margins are close, and where they'll particularly have a case long-term in Minnesota is if you see the Libertarian Party or the Independence Party get more than 5% of the vote. They have major party status then. That means in 2018, a Libertarian Party candidate is a major party candidate for governor. An Independence Party candidate would be a major party candidate for governor then. And so I could see a situation where that would be detrimental to the Republicans' prospects in terms of maintaining the necessary coalition needed in order to win. So long term, while I think that in the short term, depending on the state, it could have an impact.
Sure.
It could provide a place in which to go. But
like Utah, for example, is one where McMullen might swing it. But
sure.
Yeah.
But long term, where it has an impact on a state in Minnesota is that it could get the Libertarian or the Independence Party as a major party in this state. And then in 2018, they're able to field a major party candidate, and that candidate will be afforded the same ballot access that the Democrats and the Republicans are only granted right now.
Okay.
And it will be a very interesting when you get to debates and other things, as we've discussed.
Right, right. So like a Tim Penny or a Tom Horner that have been independence candidates in the past. Now the Independence Party in Minnesota does not have the major party status, but someone like a McMullen getting up there and getting 5%, that would bring them back up to major party status.
Correct.
So, interesting.
And that would be very, very, I mean, there's always a debate as to whether Independence Party candidates or Libertarian candidates pull more from Democrats or Republicans. I would make the argument that in the changes that have occurred in the Republican Party over the last few years, that Independent or Libertarian Party candidates would pull more from the Republicans.
Sure.
Whereas in previous years, when Jesse Ventura ran, he clearly took more out of Skip Humphrey.
Mm-hmm.
When Tim Penny ran, he clearly took more out of Roger Moe than he did, Tim Pawlenty. And so the question is, when you're starting to pull together a statewide coalition to win, having some of these having minor party candidates elevated to major party candidates, that can present an opportunity where it makes getting elected, particularly for sometimes Republicans, can be more difficult.
Sure. So you're a lifelong Republican.
Correct.
Okay. This isn't something new. This is, you've been
Yeah.
a lifelong Republican.
Correct.
Okay. And I've been all over the map on things, so I never want to assume that someone, because they are something now, they've always been that way.
No.
So lifelong Republican, you're looking at the future of the Republican Party. As you watched the convention in Cleveland, you have Ted Cruz getting up there, pointedly not endorsing Donald Trump for president. John Kasich, it's his state, he doesn't show up to the convention. The Bushes, Romney, all of these people either just staying away or completely not endorsing Mr. Trump. What do you think the future of the Republican Party, let's just presuppose Trump loses, or even if he wins, where do you think your party's going on a national level from here?
I could make the case, putting on that partisan hat that I used to wear much more strongly than I do now, that it would be better for the Republican Party if Trump were to lose than to win. But then I think about who comes in his place. Clearly, what you referenced when you wisely made reference to is Ted Cruz's appearance at the Republican National Convention, where he was one of the few candidates to go up on stage, one of the previous candidates to go on stage. It may have been the only one that didn't fully endorse and embrace Donald Trump, clearly setting himself up for a run for presidency in 4 years. I think he was making the calculation at the time that Trump would not be victorious. I would have it's as other people have said about picking your poison as in terms of which candidate would be worse to support.
Yeah.
I don't know that Ted Cruz is much of an improvement over Donald Trump in terms of the long-term viability of the party. This was an election cycle where it was, whether pundits and the media saw it, nothing was going to stop Donald Trump this cycle. This was his time. Politics is about opportunity. That being said, if you're concerned about the Republican brand, the focus as to where it goes, I don't know that many people agree that Donald Trump is going to be a good steward of that brand if he were to be elected president of the United States. We had comments that came out today from the Republican Party Minnesota chairman, Keith Downey, where he said a couple days ago that Donald Trump was a, quote, huge risk for the Republican Party, that it would be, quote, and he was concerned about there being an imperial presidency. There you have a party chairman whose job it is to support and embrace and champion the cause of endorsed candidates being unwilling to do that.
Right.
And so there is sizable trepidation and concern inside the party as to where we would look if Trump was elected 2 years from now. There's an argument to be made that if Clinton were to be elected, Hillary Clinton were to be elected, that the House Republicans through Speaker Ryan or through a Republican-controlled Senate would be a more responsible vehicle in which to message the Republican brand in contrast to Clinton than having Trump be the president of the United States. I will say to you, as a Republican, I have concerns about voting for Trump this election cycle, and I will I will likely not vote for Donald Trump this election cycle. and I'm not trying to make a huge big stand about it,
Right.
but it's just we in this state have the opportunity to write people in for presidential races on a variety of races, and I'm very likely just going to exercise that option because I have some concerns about a variety of Trump's positions that he's taken, particularly his rhetoric and his temperament. I don't think is inviting, welcoming, and lives up to, I think, the tenets and the beliefs that we as Americans hold so dear. And so I'm not willing to go as far as to vote for Clinton, but I might think of some other options in which to do some stuff. But again,
Sure.
not trying to take some big stand as other people have done, and trying to say I'm going to move to another country. We always hear that this time of year.
Costa
if this
Rica
person
or
gets
somewhere,
elected,
right.
or, yeah, I'm not going to.
Yeah.
And the same with Clinton. I have concerns about Clinton's positions that she's taken on a variety of issues, but do I ultimately think I want to be as extreme as to saying I'm going to move out of the country if Hillary Clinton's elected? No, I'm not in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to want, whoever is elected president, while I may disagree with their politics, I'm going to want them to succeed because if they succeed, the country succeeds.
Sure, sure. So it's prediction time. It's September. I know it's a little bit ahead. We're less than 2 months away. Any predictions on who will win? Any surprises out there that, as far as there's the presidency, but then there's also some Senate races, some things like that. Do you think it's ultimately going to be a good year for Democrats, Republicans, or is it just every man or woman for themselves?
Well, first of all, I think the big question on election night will be how quickly do they call the race for Clinton? Because I do believe Clinton's going to win. And so the question is it by the time Minnesotans are back at home after voting and getting out of the line, have they announced it for Clinton? Mm-hmm. She has so many, going through the Electoral College, 270 votes needed to win. She has arguably multiple paths that she can take in order to win. So many things need to break against Clinton for her not to get the presidency at this point that I think it's her race to lose. Right. Ultimately. And we got a lot of time between now and election, and there's always talk of a October surprise and other things.
Right. Yeah.
So a whole host of things. But speaking right now, if the race were held today, I believe that Clinton would win, and I think it would be a strong victory. The question is, what can be done over the next 60-some days to close the gap and change the dynamics? And that's a long time in politics. Mm-hmm. Where I think Republicans are generally is keep the House, keep the Senate. Have there be a checks and balance, kind of what we talked about the legislature.
Right.
I think that's their kind of realistic scenario. And I think depending on how some things shape up, there could be some challenges there. We've seen how Trump's candidacy has started to impact congressional races in the state. In the 2nd Congressional District where we are right now.
Correct.
There's been a variety of discussion on it. Our neighbors to the west in the 3rd Congressional District are seeing some things over there with Terry Bonoff and Eric Paulson in a tight race, or in a race that pundits are saying is a tight race because of the aggressiveness in which they're messaging on Trump. And so I think this election night, I think there'll be more surprises than there have been in the past. And the surprises could be that it was a throw the bums out type year, mm-hmm. or that it was much more of a reasonable election than people were expecting, that it could be more of a no change. I think it's going to be somewhere in between. I think there's going to be a few more surprises than we thought, but some of those traditional Republican areas, those traditional Democrat areas, I think they're going to perform well. I think with there not being a statewide election in Minnesota,
right.
There only being the presidential race and then 201 legislative seats, I think we're missing out on more of the dynamics that we're seeing in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, other states where Indiana, where you're seeing Florida, mm-hmm. Where you're seeing situations where they have contested Senate races and the presidential race is having an impact on those.
Sure. So Clinton victory. Any predictions on, so Mr. Trump, let's presumably loses the election. I'm thinking he starts his own TV network. He's got Roger Ailes on board already. He has a number of these other Fox personalities that have left the Fox network. Trump TV. He has his own platform. It's a national TV presence. Any thoughts on what he might do? That's kind of my theory is.
You know, when I first wrote about, I was on a family vacation in Chicago last year when I first wrote about Trump getting in the race. And I kind of said, look, this is going to end one of two ways. Trump gets bored, or it's going to be the wisdom of the American voter. That's going to end his presidential ambitions. I think he's become more of a caricature of himself since this race has gone on, to the point where I think what you're seeing now is pure entertainment. And so I think that will be difficult for him to step away from. He is someone who wants to be relevant, wants to be discussed, wants to be in the news, and when you take that away from them, from some people, that's very difficult to do. And I think Trump is going to have a very difficult time not being, as close as he is right now to the presidency.
Sure.
And will he be able to adjust back to the glamorous life that he had? I mean, this is a guy that traveled by, private plane, his own plane with his name, emblazoned on the side before he became the Republican nominee, and that plane's going to be there afterwards. But in terms of his commentary, his desire to be relevant in the political scene, I can see him trying to step that up. And sadly, when he officially becomes the former Republican nominee for president, what will he do to step? He'll have to find new ways in which to get excitement and enthusiasm and attention towards him. And what we've seen with Trump is every time he says things that would be very detrimental to other candidates, it only increases it. And so likely, if he does some form of entertainment type situation where he's pay-per-view commentary, things like that, I think the rhetoric is going to be more surprising, more shocking, and sadly it'll probably find a home with some people. And Sarah Palin took that route after the 08 presidency. She later left being governor of the state of Alaska and embarked on a little bit of a publicity kind of
reality shows and things.
Where she had her own, she was a commentator that had her own show. I can see Trump thinking that's too small of a venue for him. And I hadn't thought about the Trump TV station, but that seems likely the most type of thing. Something with his brand, something where he can control it and pick up that fight. Because aside from the variety of groups that he's gone after this election cycle, one of his favorite is the media. And so I could see him maybe partnering up with his old buddy Roger Ailes, who's advising him right now, and setting up some type of dynamic where they can rail against the Fourth Estate in some other type of way.
Well, Michael, always great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Look forward to seeing what happens with Mr. Trump and Ms. Clinton, and stay tuned for more. So here's a thought. The United States has been, with few exceptions, a two-party country for most of its existence. And for the past 150 years or so, those two parties, as you probably know, have been the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So when some members of the modern-day Republican Party, including Donald Trump, like to claim that they're the party of Lincoln, they would be well advised to read up on the history that has brought us to where we are today. What few people take the time to research is that the philosophies of those two parties have essentially flipped during that time. While today's Republicans favor a weak federal government, more state rights, and local control, the Republicans back in the 1860s stood for a strong national government that guaranteed rights for all Americans, regardless of which state they lived in or the color of their skin. For example, the issue of slavery comes to mind. Now, while the southern states favored it and even started an armed conflict in order to keep it, the North, led by Republican President Abraham Lincoln, held firm and believed that the entire nation, not just the northern states, should be free for everyone. The result, as we know, was a 4-year civil war, and those who favored a unified national government prevailed. We are called the United States of America, after all. After the Civil War, the party slowly started to be torn apart and impacted by regional differences primarily related to civil rights. Much of the South, dominated by whites, didn't like the idea of African Americans gaining power or even being able to cast a vote without being harassed, as recently as the 1960s. So it warrants mention today that it was the Democratic Party that pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was the Democratic Party that nominated the first woman to be vice president in 1984. It was the Democratic Party that nominated and elected the first African American president, as well as the first female nominee to be president this year. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, the party's current nominee, Mr. Trump, led the charge for birtherism a few years back, calling President Obama a Kenyan who shouldn't even be president. And now, as the Republican nominee, he recently said Hillary Clinton doesn't look presidential, clearly a commentary on her gender. And he's also critical of African American communities, saying their living conditions and their schools are so bad that they have nothing to lose by voting for him. Facing this kind of nonsense, I'll leave it to you to wonder in which party Abraham Lincoln would belong today. I'm Tom Bullington. We'll see you next time on Everybody Loves Politics.